takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. If you think about that, you'll do things differently. Warren Buffett. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for the chance to speak to you about this topic on behalf of William Buck. As you know, we're the naming rights sponsors. We're delighted to be here again. And as you probably know, we're a full-service chartered accounting and audit firm. So, personal branding. Why am I talking about this to CFOs? You don't look like you need a lot of education on the subject, but I'm hoping you'll pick a couple of points and find it interesting regardless. So, let's crack on. Okay, not to press the right button would be useful. So, the agenda. What is personal branding? There's a lot of confusion around that topic. Why exactly is it important? And then we get into stereotyping, which of course is why it's important. And then the 5 main elements of your personal brand, as I see them, certainly appearance, body language, voice, behaviour, and online image. So, what is personal branding? Let's clarify. It's not fashion tips from Gok. It's not just about a complex social media strategy, and most experts seem to think of it is literally one of those two things. And this slide would suggest it's about a colour, and for most people, our personal brand has nothing to do with a colour. Although, for some of us of a certain age, if we associate the colour black with a person, we might think of the man in black, Johnny Cash. If we think of the colour pink, we might think, well, pink. But of course, if we think orange, you might have heard it said already that America is such a progressive country that only 8 years after electing its first black president, it elected its first orange one. Back, however, Donald Trump is such fun to pick on, isn't he? Back to the real definition though. Your personal brand is what differentiates you from others. And no less than Tom Peters tells us, it's the most important job in business today. So it's not fluff. Today, of course, we only have a short time together and we're just looking at the business side of your personal brand, business focus. What you can do to increase your trustworthiness, your gravitas and your reputation overall to other people. But let's turn to a real expert for the ideal definition. Your fast readers. Yes, this is personal branding in action. So the question, of course, becomes how do you want people to perceive you? More like McCaw, or more like Quade Cooper? More like Miley Cyrus, or more like Lord? More like the Orange Ruffy, or Barack Obama? More like, oh, I'm sorry, that's really confusing. Sorry, I made a mistake there. Just before moving on, I will apologise to anyone in the audience who's friends with the ex-mayor, but I'm not going to apologise to him, nor to Bill Clinton. Why? Because what they did to their personal brand, they did, and to some degree, they've got to live with that for the rest of their lives. Your personal brand is important, ladies and gentlemen. John T. Malloy wrote this very famous, huge-selling book in '75, and he kept researching it and publishing it for years. And he came up with this statement. My question to you is, does it make sense or does it seem really shallow and really obnoxious? What I would say is that I started writing on this topic of personal branding while living in the US in 2000. And over the years, I've observed people's personal brand and the effect that it has on their lives and mine as well. And I can tell you for sure that when I go into a shop, dressed like I am now, versus dressed like I am on the right there, jeans and t-shirt, a bit more scruffy, the staff of the shop go from, worst case scenario, from being nice to almost a little nervous, from being deferent to distrustful, welcoming to wary, and obsequious to observing. On the left, I'm sir, and on the right, I'm mate. And that's why, although this is a business focus this morning, it's why your personal brand should be considered if you're sitting down face-to-face to negotiate a major loan or any kind of deal, for example. I'm not kidding, the next 2 slides are a little bit uncomfortable. Are you familiar with the term genetic sexual attraction? This slide says it all. Genetic sexual attraction is the very strong attraction that occurs sometimes between close blood relatives who don't meet for the first time until they're adults. All together now, ew. But let me ask you this. What percentage of the time do you think this happens? I mean, you can see this example. This is a true life mother and son who fell in love. So how often do you think it happens? You're good with numbers. Yell out a percentage. How often? No one wants to be, it's just too gross. You don't want to get into it. Well, according to the Post-Adoption Centre and the University College of London, it's over 50% of the time. I'm sorry to gross you out before morning tea, but the reality is we really fancy people who look a lot like us. And that's what happens here. It's called assortative mating. We know that when we see facial features that are similar to ours, we assign very positive characteristics to those features. Look at Donald Trump and his daughter. Anyway, let's move on to have a look at how quickly we judge other people and indeed how shockingly thoroughly we judge other people. Now, my statistician mate tells me that 150 milliseconds is about 1/7 of a second. So that's how quickly we decide if we're attracted to somebody. And from there we extrapolate wildly. We think that person is more trustworthy, more decent, probably more hardworking, etc. 2014 study, as you can see, Harvard, Dartmouth and New York University found we make some decisions about other people within 1/300th of a second, specifically fear-based decisions. Then there's the 7-11 rule. This was a 2009 study, as you can probably see, Harvard and New York University and Solomon, which is an international university, which indicates that this is not just American cultural bias. What the study found is that we make the following 11, well it's really 11 plus decisions about people within 7 seconds, not of meeting them, but of seeing them. What can we possibly judge in that time? Try this. Stunning, isn't it? And we can say this is wrong, but it simply is. And that's why personal branding is anything but fluff. It is a serious topic. So let's have a quick look at stereotyping. I would like to draw the attention of the President of the United States to the top left-hand picture. Okay, a few examples for you. We're going to start with the really ugly end. And if you're aware of this, but the specifics are very ugly indeed. In most countries around the world, as you can see in criminal sentencing, men get harsher sentences than women. Attractive women and baby-faced men get shorter sentences. And appallingly, in most of the world, black criminals get longer sentences than white criminals. That is the very ugly end. And not quite so ugly end, there's also occupational stereotypes. At Harvard, a group of university students were shown a photograph of a man and they were told that he's a statistics professor. And they were asked to describe him in a few words. And they could tell by looking at him that he was cold and remote and tense. But also at Harvard, another group of students were shown a photograph of a man and they were told that he is a humanistic psychology professor. And they could tell just by looking at him that he's warm and deeply concerned with students. Occupational stereotypes can be interesting, but surely the best known one is CFOs and accountants. Right? Work with me, people. So it leads us to this question. A show of hands, please, if you believe that stereotyping is always a negative thing. You're not going to be led on this, are you? You're not going to be suckered. I absolutely agree. I think that as long as we are stereotyped as good people, as decent, honest, successful people, we don't have a problem with that. In fact, several years ago, I was staying in New York and I checked into a hotel in Brooklyn for the weekend and there was a dental conference going on. And every time, somehow my name got mixed up with the dentist. And every time I was in and out of that hotel, it was Dr. Bird this and Dr. Bird that. And I can tell you, I didn't mind it at all. I quite enjoyed it. Let's dig a little deeper, shall we? Of that slide, I'd like to draw your attention in particular to the centre of the slide. So the forefathers of us who are in Africa, they'd started farming by then, but the rest of us were still wandering tribes in Eurasia, and you can see the point I draw about Trump supporters. So why then do we stereotype so rapidly? Safety. Obviously these pictures come from well before 12,000 years ago. But of course we're talking fright, fight or flight. 12,000 years ago, if I see you coming over the hill, I have to quickly work out, are you from my tribe? Because if not, you might want to steal my food and you might want to steal me as food. 12,000 years ago is a blink of an eye, of course, in evolutionary terms. And that's why we stereotype so quickly. Tiny little part of the brain called the amygdala is the fear center. And I've already mentioned it takes us 1/300th of a second to decide if we are afraid of an animal or indeed a person. So why are we still stereotyping that much? Well, A, 12,000 years isn't long, and B, if you are not tonight, you weren't in lovely Auckland, but you're in a major city around the world, doesn't really matter where, New York or Rio, and you walk around the corner and you see these two men walking towards you, how are you going to feel and what are you going to think? Now, I can't tell you much about the posh-looking bloke on the left, presumably he's a model. I can tell you a bit about the bloke on the right. He's a real-life member of an El Salvadorian gang, one of the most murderous gangs and one of the most murderous individuals in the world. If you saw him, it would make very good sense for you to be afraid and to avoid contact with him. But the problem is we don't just make fast decisions. We go on from there to confirm them to ourselves. The confirmation bias is one of the strongest natural biases that we have as a human being. What does it mean? It means the tendency to interpret all new evidence as backing up what we already believe. We do this all the time. So let's recap, shall we? In 1/300th of a second, we decide if we're afraid of somebody. 1/7 of a second, we decide if we're attracted to somebody, and from there we extrapolate wildly about what decent human beings they are. Then within 7 seconds, we basically decide everything about a human being, and then we comfortably confirm it and tell ourselves we were right all along. And that's why your mother and Will Rogers were exactly right when they said we don't get a second chance to make a first impression. And you may say, Kieran, so what? Well, I would ask, so what are you doing to use confirmation bias to your example? So let's get into a few specifics. First up, we'll talk about appearance, then body language, voice, behaviour, and finally, the online image. So, appearance. Today we're really focusing on the big occasion, on the CFO when you're leading, whatever enormously important occasion it is, what you can do to have the greatest impact, the greatest gravitas. Of course, on Casual Friday, the rules do change, but the old adage about dressing one level above your audience always works. I'm wearing a tie when most of you aren't to show respect for you as the audience. It always works. So, physical appearance. Tom Ford is a fashion designer, so he may very well say that. But I think there's a lot of truth to this. And imagine if you go to see your doctor for the first time, so you've never met, sorry about the gender bias, in this case it's him, and he wasn't dressed like he is on the left, but rather on the right. How are you going to feel about that? I know how I'm going to feel. I'm going to feel a little uncomfortable. And as an aside, several years ago, living in the States, I had an occasion where I had to hire a lawyer. And when I met with him, I was quite surprised to find that at the bottom of his suit were trainers. He was wearing a suit and trainers, and a few weeks later, I realised the guy was utterly useless, and I had to get rid of him. So maybe there's a lot to this personal branding. All right, let's have a look at some case studies. Excuse me. 3 groups of men were sent out around the United States to go for job interviews. All of these experiments, you can imagine, they're controlled, as in all of these men were roughly the same age, they had similar CVs, similar backgrounds, similar interview skills, and they dressed exactly the same, with just one difference. The group represented by our friend Mr. Bond here wore a conservative silk tie. The second group were told to wear a cheap tie, and the third group not to wear a tie and to apologise. Sorry, I spilled some coffee on the way over. That kind of thing. Now, interestingly, when feedback was sought from the interviewers, the group with no tie were treated more seriously than the group with the cheap tie, but the word they used most commonly to describe them was losers. Whereas the group with the cheap tie were described as they had a bad attitude. They were not articulate, they were not able, and they were not honest. those polyester ties, eh? And finally, the group with the quality tie, they got most of the job offers. They were described as able, astute, and capable. Yes, the tie is falling out of fashion, but ladies and gentlemen, particularly gentlemen, don't believe the power of the tie is gone. It simply hasn't. Next up, the curious case of chuggers or charity muggers. In this experiment in the United States, excuse me, they did or as Jimmy Carr would describe them, you know, the young people with the clipboards and the optimism. What they did was they placed one on one side of the street and one on the other, multiple locations throughout the United States. Excuse me. They dressed the usual thing, young, looked the same, similar age. They dressed exactly the same except for one tiny detail. One side of the street, they wore a polo shirt with no logo. On the other side of the street, they wore a polo shirt with the posh logo, you know, the alligator or something like that. And consistently, the person wearing the posh logo was given more money by members of the public. People find this slightly uncomfortable and slightly disturbing. If we're going to help people, why would we want to help people that look like they're more successful than others? And I believe there is only one answer to this. That tiny signal takes our brain in one of two directions. And it does basically relate. It comes down to attraction or fear. Who is the least threatening to me? That's the person I'll give the money to. That's what our bias does. Now, the next case study is not a tall tale, but it is about height. And it is truly fascinating. The average height of the American male is 5'9". Only 14.5% of American males are 6 foot or above. But let's take one small subgroup of the American population, shall we? Ooh, I don't know, chief executives of Fortune 500 companies. So in the general population, 14.5% of people are 6 foot or above. Chief executive of the Fortune 500 companies, 58% are 6 foot or above. What about 6'2" or above? That's only 3.9% of the general male American population, and it's 30% of chief executives of Fortune 500. Is that a coincidence? Not a chance. Research in Sweden and in the UK tells us similar things. And we know from research, we think tall people are really smart and really competent. And interestingly, obviously, height does count in business, but it also counts in romance, doesn't it? When you think about your life and all of the couples, all of the straight couples that you've ever known, how many times was the woman taller than the man? It's so unusual, and it seems that this is where this bias comes from. Tall people make us feel protected, therefore they should be the boss. And just a couple of other points on romantic attraction, but before then I would point out that obviously what you need to do is get taller, right? Wearing high heels in the office can be a little, shall we say, problematic, but not everyone knows that it is entirely possible to get about 1, maybe 2 inches taller if you've got one of these at home. I'm not saying it's not agonising, but you can actually do it. And the great thing is, if you've been married a long time and you ask your other half to stretch on one of those, I reckon there's a good chance you will. But anyway, a couple of other points on romantic attraction, as I said, just for fun before we move on. The colour red has been shown to make both males and females more attractive to each other. This is not the forum in which to discuss why. You can probably work that out for yourself. Now, women are more attracted to men with a 1.6 ratio between shoulders and waist. Shallow. And men are more attracted to women with a 0.7 ratio between waist and hips. And a guitar and a dog both makes men more attractive to women. So gentlemen, if you're single and you don't want to be, it's enough tips for you, right? Final case study. Bearing in mind the fact that chiropractors, this is not a GP, this is a chiropractor, chiropractors do not use stethoscopes at all. Would it surprise you to know that in the US, chiropractors who wear stethoscopes around their neck typically make more money than other chiropractors associated with that strong personal brand of doctors? Okay, let's get into a few tips. I doubt you'll pick up much because you're all well dressed, but you never know. So first of all, to look at the ladies, you can see the slide here. On the right, casual, the left, business professional. In reality, she looks great in all of them, doesn't she? And she could wear any of those outfits in an office in New Zealand. But business professional on the left is the best. It's the most heavyweight. Why? Dark suit. The skirt comes down to the knee. Why? Because sexy and serious are not the same thing. She's got low heels, simple accessories. Why does that count? We know that big, loud accessories can be distracting to other people, particularly males. Minimal, conservative toned makeup. If she was going to add anything, she could add, rather than a handbag, a briefcase, and she would really look like a heavyweight business person, wouldn't she? So let's have a look at the blokes. I've got a young man here who's done pretty well. He's got a fairly conservative haircut, very little jewellery. In fact, a ring and a watch are about as far as it goes in the Western world for the ideal business, personal brand. He's got a dark suit, and as we know, black, navy blue and dark grey are by far the most powerful suits, colours to wear. Oops, sorry, go back. He's also got a light shirt. Why is that important? This is an association which we still got a tiny bit with a couple of 100 years ago, where you had to be wealthy to have a white shirt that actually looked white, because most people didn't have many clothes and you needed somebody to wash it for you. That's why IBMers from 1950s right through to the 80s only allowed their people to wear white shirts. He's got a silk tie, his belt and his shoes match. I can't see his socks, but I bet they match his shoes. And he's got no tattoos or piercings. Sorry to be boring, I'm going to come back to that shortly. This is an important point. Fashion is not the friend of personal branding, not really, not the big fashion, not what GOP would advise you to wear. Look at these people. I know that's extreme, but fashion can look a little bit silly when you kind of look over decades. So, some more research. Visible tattoos. Big US poll every year, the Harris poll in 2008, found that 32% of people who don't have tattoos believe that people with tattoos are likely to do something deviant. Perhaps more culturally relevant, a 2014 study from Canada found that 77% of employers said they either are or might be less likely to hire someone with tattoos. So there's still a little bit of a disadvantage there. Facial hair, awfully trendy with young people, aren't they, these beards? 2015 study from the US found that clean-shaven males are 45% more attractive to employers. Didn't mention clean-shaven women, I'm sure that would be an interesting finding. But clean-shaven men are rated to be both more professional and more creative. And it seems, looking at some early research, that there's just a little bit of a link with eccentricity and with vanity. It's not 100%, there's a lot of different findings, but there's just a little bit of a warning around the beard, particularly the big bushy beard. Gentlemen, you came to a CFO conference, you didn't expect to be talking about cleavage in the morning. But in all seriousness, I mention cleavage specifically because it has been shown by research to be a promotion killer in the workplace. Not good for the personal brand. Now, Oprah says let's talk about hair, and when she's got as much hair as that, how can I possibly argue with her? I do apologise for the gender bias here. Although this 2000 Yale study looked at men and women, it only looked at 3 styles for women, and it wasn't quite as clear-cut what they found. So I've got, you can see 1, 2 and 3 hairstyles. I've got 3 different descriptions that people at Yale looked at these hairstyles and said, this is what it tells about the person. So if they don't match, I'm going to read them all out to you and then ask you to match them with the hairstyles. So description A, that hairstyle apparently says that bloke is the most sexy and also the most self-centered. Description B, least intelligent and most careless. And description C, most intelligent and most affluent. So I'm going to lead you a little bit. I'm going to ask the question in the right order to try and help you. So starting with C, most intelligent and most affluent. Is that 1, 2 or 3? 2. I didn't hear anyone say anything else, so we can tell something. Interestingly, if you happen to know who Ryan Tracy is, he's worth many millions and he's a highly intelligent individual. So again, the personal brand does fit. Okay, let's move then to B, least intelligent and most careless. Is that 1 or 3? We had a real mixture there, 1 and 3, which just shows that maybe we're better off sticking with the conservative haircut. It is actually 3. So Fabio's not quite as Fabio as he thought he was. I'm not sure what's going on with his pecs there. Those look like implants. But anyway, I'm not an accountant, so I'm not that good at numbers, but I guess that leaves us with number one being sexy and most self-centered. Quite a common hairstyle amongst Hollywood types these days. A quick check-in with colours: black, power; white, purity; red, passion, action, danger; blue, confidence. We see a lot of blue suits at this time in the political cycle; and grey, stability. Love those accountants in the grey suits. Voice. Just a couple of points here. Deeper voices carry more authority than do higher pitched voices. And it's interesting to note that an ex-Prime Minister of New Zealand, I won't mention names, although hers is Helen Clark, obviously she has a deep voice, and she recognised early on that that was a good part of a formidable brand for a female politician. But she, like most Kiwis, realised that her voice went up a little at the end of the sentences, and she had coaching to make sure that that didn't happen. So she took that powerful brand and amplified it. Speaking more slowly when we're under pressure. What happens when we're under real pressure? We get barked at by the CEO or whatever it might be. We want to speak quickly, don't we, to come up with an explanation. Slowing it down slightly appears more self-confident. And finally, on the phone, 80% of how we communicate is tone of voice. It is not the words we use. If you say some good words to somebody in an aggressive tone of voice, all they hear is aggression. So, a couple of points on body language really quickly. You know this, don't you? The key is open versus closed. When we feel under threat, when the amygdala kicks off, we want to kind of get into a fetal position. We want to curl up. In fact, when we're under real stress, there are three areas, particularly as children, that we want to protect. They are vulnerable areas and very important to us. So if, for example, you've left some biscuits on a plate on the table and they suddenly disappear and your 4-year-old's in the area and you're asking him or her what happened to them, you might see this one. And go, I don't know what happened to them. Protecting the throat. The other one we retain as adults, protect the heart and lungs. And finally, kids will do the fig leaf. I didn't steal those. So of course, appearing confident and transferring that confidence to members of our staff, to investors, to whomever it might be. Open body language is the trick, and hands really are the trick. Now obviously we've got a couple of Republican presidents here. It's not a fair comparison because Ronnie Reagan is posing for a very formal photo. George W, I think, is about to get into a gunfight. But actually what George W is doing, you see the difference in their hands? That's how we are when we're relaxed. Our hands are half closed, and as soon as we get tense, they want to do this. Why? Because that provides us with a method of defending ourselves. In fact, when we see somebody on the street, they jump out, they get a fright, we do this. We are saying, I am not a threat, I have no weapons in my hands, and I'm not making fists. That's why this is such an important signal. Now, it's fair to say, I think you'd agree, that Ronald Reagan was not considered the very brightest president of the 20th century. And yet you ask Americans about him and they say, what a leader he was. And they say partly it was about the incredible self-confidence the man had. And after seeing this photograph, I've managed to see a lot of footage of Ronnie, and I noticed that when he comes out of the White House with his entourage, their hands are all like that, his are like that. It's an actor's trick to make people think that you are very confident. So remember that for those very important occasions. Dale Carnegie, actually, if you ever take their presentation skills course, they teach something that no one else does, and it's hugely valuable, and that is, when you're speaking, spend just a bit of your time with your arms dangling down, and your hands unnaturally straight. It feels weird, but it doesn't look that odd, does it? Well, I've drawn your attention to it now. But I made the ludicrous error of getting involved in politics in the 90s, and I remember going up for a political debate for the first time. And I was way beyond nervous. I was terrified, my heart was pounding, dry mouth, all that good stuff. But I remembered some of the time to do this. And I got off stage and people came up to me and said, how are you so eerily calm up there? Remember the hands. Walk like a boss. What do I mean by that? I mean two things specifically. I used to work for the New Zealand Institute of Management, and I managed the mentoring program there, so I got to meet a lot of wonderful chief executives. And I used to say, how do you pick a winner when you're hiring somebody? And they would say more often than not, the way they walk. If it's on the balls of the feet and quickly, that person is going to get things done. So it's a great sense of purpose to give off to your staff. The other point is, mentioned before about height. I don't really think anyone's going to get on the rack tonight. But we all know people who are fairly short that we don't think of as short, and vice versa. And the trick is, if you imagine, if you're anything like me when you're growing up, you heard a lot of, Kieran, stand up straight, put your shoulders back. Well, that was already too many things to think about at once. But as a presenter, I was taught, imagine you're dangling from a piece of string from the top of your head. And if you just picture that, immediately you get that kind of military posture and you walk with power and purpose. It helps you be a leader. People want to follow you. Next point, just 2 points on eye contact. One is very obvious. In the West, we love eye contact, don't we? And in 2/3 of the globe, eye contact rules are, of course, much more complex. Don't hold eye contact with an older person, that's rude. So I only mention this in passing. You know this rule, but do you have members of your staff who are migrants from outside the Western world? Make sure you teach them this stuff. And also teach them how to shake hands. By the way, Mr. Trump, there's only 2 rules for a rapport-building handshake. That is, hand upright, not dominant, not submissive, but upright, and you squeeze the same as the other person. It's that simple, Mr. Trump. The other point about eye contact, and this is so hot off the presses in terms of research, if you Google it, you won't find any information on it. It's called eye lock. We've always had a sense, haven't we, when say dealing with our children or indeed with the person we're falling in love with, eye contact is important. What we now know is that after a few minutes of fairly solid eye contact between 2 people, both brains, both people, the right hemisphere, starts to align. It brings trust. It allows people to learn faster. It completely changes the feeling between them in the conversation. By the way, you know how we Skype and we feel like it's not quite like meeting face to face? That's because our brain does not produce the same chemicals when we see someone on a screen. That's why we like to meet somebody. So, and the other side of this is, if we try and persuade anyone of anything, like a doctor trying to prescribe something to somebody after only a few seconds of eye contact, that makes the other person automatically look for the negative in what is said. So eye contact, eye lock is hugely important. Moving quickly along, behaviour obviously is a massively important part of your personal brand. Just 2 points on this. Does your behaviour suggest you have high self-esteem and high self-confidence? A lot of what we're talking about helps with that. Secondly, how consistent is your behaviour? Think of the Warren Buffett comment before. My boss in the UK used to say to me, Kieran, your temper is terribly important. Never lose it. And he was right, and I try to remember that, because I know people can be wonderful all the time and they lose it with their staff just once, and that permanently damages the personal brand. I've really come right at the end of the speech to this point on social media, because it's not personal branding, it's one of the forms of media available to promote your personal brand, and that's what people misunderstand. You can promote your personal brand through writing articles for newspapers, for magazines, for association newsletters in the industry in which you work. Public speaking is a great way to promote your personal brand, as is LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, of course. And as you know, it is crucial to protect your online reputation. No oops, no oops. So Google yourself and find out how you look, and always protect that brand. We started with this question, what is personal branding? We'll finish with, what is your personal brand? If you think about your appearance, your body language, your voice, your behaviour, and you promote it online, you can make your personal brand be exactly what you want it to be. And that ends my session. If you've got questions, I'm going to be at the William Buck stand all day. Love to chat about personal branding.